On Wednesday, the Home Secretary, Theresa May, announced some changes to the way in which the state would deal with people suspected of being involved in terrorism. The previous 28-day detention without charge period was reduced to 14 days. Many of the coalition supporters had hoped that the Home Secretary would completely scrap the controversial control orders regime, a form of house arrest involving electronic tagging, curfews and denial of access to the internet and telephones. Both Conservatives and Liberal Democrats had banged the civil liberties drum loudly in opposition, and many were profoundly uneasy about limiting the freedoms of people who had never been convicted of any crime. But in the event, they were disappointed.
The right place for a terrorist is in a prison cell. But where successful prosecution or deportation is not immediately possible, no responsible government could allow these individuals to go freely about their terrorist activities. We are also clear that the current control order regime is imperfect and has not been as effective as it should be. We therefore propose to repeal control orders. Instead, we will introduce a new package of measures which is better focused and has more targeted restrictions, supported by significantly increased resources for surveillance and other investigative tools.
These new arrangements were promptly branded Control Orders Light by civil liberties campaigners. So why had the Home Secretary felt the need to hold back from a thoroughgoing abolition and risk being accused of breaking a pledge? Some pundits, supposedly in the know, whispered that the security service, better known as MI5, had made a compelling case behind the scenes for the Home Secretary to keep a sheaf of draconian powers in her quiver. The backdrop to these security concerns is, of course, the phenomenon of violent political Islamism, something that's both global, as the bombing at Moscow airport reminded us this week, and local, in the sense that it impacts upon community relations at street level in neighbourhoods across the UK. All the major political parties agree on the need both to combat the terrorism and challenge the ideology that promotes it. But this can cause problems. Last week, the Conservative Party chairman, Baroness Varsi, who is a Muslim, claimed that what she called Islamophobia had become socially respectable at British dinner parties. She compared the way people talk of Islam today with the casual anti-Semitism that was the social norm in Britain in the 1920s. And Lady Varsi went further, saying that it was wrong to talk about moderate and extremist Muslims. But if that's the case, how are politicians, or dinner party guests come to that, to distinguish between those Muslims who call for the death of apostates, or for homosexuals to be thrown off cliffs, or who want to replace our democratic institutions with an Islamic caliphate, and those Muslims who absolutely do not? I consulted Timothy Winter, an Islamic studies scholar from Cambridge University, who is also known by his Islamic name Abdel Hakim Murad, and Douglas Murray, the director of the think tank, the Centre for Social Cohesion. Timothy Winter first.
My view is that you can speak in terms of moderation and extremism in terms of highly politicised or quote-unquote fundamentalist readings of religion. So you can talk about extreme Islamists or moderate Islamists. But a moderate Muslim or an extreme Muslim as such suggests that you can have too much of religion, which really isn't what insiders want to hear. You can have the wrong kind of religion, but you can't have too much goodness or too much belief in God.
Douglas Murray, are you happy with that?
No, I have to say I was rather bemused by Baroness Warzi's comments, because she seemed to miss the point, which is that the reason why people use the term moderate Muslim is precisely to caveat and make completely clear before saying anything else that the speaker believes that the vast majority of Muslims are indeed moderate and have nothing to do with the tiny proportion of extreme followers of their faith. One of the crucial things of what Saeeda Warzi seemed to be talking about the other day is this concept of Islamophobia. This word, this term, is a pollution of the language, because Islamophobia currently means everything from those people who do indeed dislike immigrants, as happens in every society in history, regrettably, and has to be tackled, but all the way through to perfectly legitimate historical criticism of Islam and of its central texts. Every single time this word is used, it pollutes the English language further. And I do wish that somebody in her situation had focused on the real problems we face, instead of spreading the blame, avoiding the issue, and ducking the big questions.
Well, it's not a word that I like to use myself, partly because I think it's too polemical, harsh, judgmental, pathologizes those who take a particular view that, as you say, may well be based on what they take to be an objective scholarly assessment rather than just xenophobia. I don't like the word very much, but I think that the point she was making is still a valid one. There is a legitimate fear amongst very many marginal, vulnerable Muslim minorities in Europe now that there is a kind of traditional right-wing chauvinism on the march again that is no longer allowed to speak against racial communities, but has found, to its great joy, that if it polemicizes fiercely and makes huge generalizations about Muslims, it suddenly gets a third of the votes. And we're seeing this in Scandinavian countries, in Holland, countries that until 10 years ago were bastions of liberalism, suddenly voting for people who are calling for minaret bans, for taxes on the hijab, for religiously specific immigration tests. And that is alarming, not just to Saida Warsi, but I think to most people who are committed to the traditional model of Europe as a community of equal communities.
I just wondered if you could tell us what, as it were, a moderate take on the appropriate penalty for apostasy would be, or a moderate take on the desirability of a caliphate, or these things that do worry people in rhetorical form.
Well, we have to recall that Islam, again, doesn't have a central source of authority. You can't find a single voice who speaks for Islam. The religion is enormously diverse. It's disorganized religion, if you like. It's not organized religion. In many ways, I think that's a healthy thing because there's a big polemic, a huge argument, fundamentalists, liberals, modernists, feminists, everybody having a go at each other. Eventually, some kind of consensus will emerge. We're almost going through a Reformation-type stage at the moment with the Enlightenment added simultaneously, and that's not going to be an easy argument, and it's not always going to be a peaceful argument. Look at Europe's history. The European Reformation was perhaps the most violent episode in its history, and with the spread of Saudi-type fundamentalist religion with the petrodollars, which is a major part of this problem, which hasn't been mentioned yet and deserves to be, there's a certain puritanism and a desire for a literal interpretation of Scripture that is really derailing the process which had been ongoing since the 19th century and the beginning of Ottoman reforms towards a more open and intelligent religious engagement with modernity.
But what is that more moderate and more open and intelligent take in relation to these issues?
Well, for instance, Abdurrahman Wahid, who for years campaigned against American-backed dictatorship in Indonesia, and as a very traditional person who'd memorized the Quran, a religious scholar, graduate of Al-Azhar, led the country into a very open type of democracy where those issues that you've mentioned are simply not legislated against. Although on the caliphate issue that's slightly different because the caliphate is not figured as a kind of generalissimo figure in a uniform who struts around and tells everybody how to pray. The caliph is somebody who precisely doesn't interfere in people's religious life. The caliph is somebody whose name is recited in the sermons and who is a symbolic symbol of Muslim unity. And that's what one is taught in the traditional creeds in traditional madrasas where I've studied myself. It's not this image of a kind of fascist Führer that is trying to rule the world. That's a travesty of the classical doctrine.
Douglas Murray, could it be then that it's not only Islamists that are being too literalist in this view, that it could be their critics and opponents too?
Discussing this is very often like trying to nail jelly to a wall. The question of apostasy you just asked, I mean, it is not nothing that the four main schools of Sharia and Sunni Islam continue to mandate the penalty of death for apostasy.
I recently attended a seminar in Jordan, and the chief muftis of the various neighbouring countries were there. Everybody said maybe a custodial sentence, certainly not the death penalty. There's only one exception.
Too kind. It still remains the case, as far as I'm aware, that the majority of scholars in these traditions and the leaders of these traditions continue to say this is the case. I hope very much that in the future more and more people will merely mandate a sentence of prison for instance, people who have freedom of conscience. But this comes back to the key issue, which you also mentioned in relation to what you say some Muslims see as the rise of parties they don't like in the West. The point is on this is that Europe has seen this before. We've been through this before. We've been through clerics trying to make grabs beyond their own domain. We've seen a continent torn apart by precisely this kind of thing, where you have to show me your cleric and I have to show you mine, and so on. And the reason why so many people are fearful, and the reason why I don't think it should be dismissed as merely right-wing, and in fact it isn't right-wing in many of these cases, is the fact that Europeans have a legitimate reason to be concerned with the fact that there is a drift within Islam today, which they see, rightly, I think, as growing, which is deeply intolerant of the premises of our liberal societies, and that we have to draw a line somewhere. We have to, at the very least, let people know who live in our societies and who are part of our societies what our societies will tolerate and where we draw the line.